Hello and welcome to the Cardiac Cats YouTube channel. We are live on YouTube. Unfortunately, not for the best circumstances, as the Jaguars season has come to a very early end as they fell to the Tennessee Titans 28-20 yesterday. So we're going to be talking about that. We're going to be talking about this season, some of the big questions just with this team. Some overreactions are more than welcome. It's a safe space as far as just venting about what happened, because it was definitely a very, very sucky finish to the season. It's about as bad as it gets. So we're going to talk about all that. I do want to ask y'all to start, for college football fans in here, who is going to watch the game tonight? Because I know I am. That's why we're doing this a little earlier. And who are you rooting for? I personally am big on Washington for this game. Been a huge Penix fan this year, following him. Hopefully he pulls it out. We'll see. But I know we got some Michigan fans in this fan base, so maybe they'll get their first one in a little while. But we've got a few things we're going to look at here. So I've got salary cap pulled up. We've got PFF to look at any players we want, Tankathon, draft order, and then I want to give you guys a little bit of a look at the draft for this next year, some of the players we could talk about, some of the routes that Jacksonville's going to have. Probably not going to do a mock draft or anything, but that's kind of our idea here. So that's what's up. All right, we got Andrea in here saying, I tried to be positive as I could. Team is fixable. Just have to get the right people to do it, starting from Balky, in my honest opinion. I completely agree. It's hard to be positive right now. I am really concerned that there is going to be essentially no moves made to this roster. More so the coaching staff. I think the roster, they're not going to do as many moves as what we would like. But one thing I did kind of hear, just listening to some of the people that are bigger in like Jaguars media, is they're going to have to take probably a week before they can really assess this season and talk about what all went wrong and really acknowledge the problems. Because I think there's things that clearly they just haven't noticed on film. For example, commending Luke Fortner at your press conference. I mean, I know you can't just destroy the guy, right? But there's a way of saying things to where you can acknowledge the issue. And the way he went about it was basically just saying, yeah, he's been fine. We just got to work on strength. He's out there for us. That's great. And that's kind of absurd, because Fortner was probably the worst player on the team this season when we talk about what the expectations are of just being a starter. Like, this guy, I don't know if I've ever seen in my life a player who's worse at run blocking. I don't think it even comes close. I mean, he's like the Kadarius Toney of run blockers. But unfortunately, I think there's a chance that he starts next year, but we'll see. And a lot of this does come down to Balky because, he drafted him. And there's a lot of decisions this team makes that are questionable. The one thing I am trying to think about, though, is the fact that Jacksonville did make a lot of really good moves that first season when Doug Peterson came in, when they knew that the roster needed to be improved, that they just simply weren't good enough. In this last year is really an issue of two things. One is complacency, of thinking where you are is good enough. You don't have to do all this. It's almost a sense of pride, which we've seen in the locker room quite a few times over the last couple of years, which it's kind of crazy because there's not a lot to be proud of. I mean, you went 9-8 2 seasons. Doesn't mean a whole lot. Congratulations. You're slightly above average. I think that's one thing. I think the other is urgency. You get players who just simply didn't step up in the big moments. And they're all talking like they're waiting for someone to make that big play, and no one did it. Lawrence said himself, I think just a couple weeks ago, and then you go watch how he played at the end of that game, and what does he do? He throws it out of bounds on 4th and 2 at the end of the game. And maybe that's his shoulder. That's benefit of the doubt, but I mean, we talk about I might have said this on the video last night, but you'll hear it again. But like people just destroyed Kirk Cousins last year when he threw a check down on the game, what should have been the game extending play for the Vikings. Threw it like 2 yards down the field. They had to go 10, and the guy got tackled immediately. That's infinitely better than throwing it out of bounds. They didn't even give the player a chance. So there's just things like that where players that last year stepped up just weren't doing anything. It's bizarre that that's the case when this team acknowledged that they do need to have urgency. I mean, they talk about that a lot. That was not something that they weren't aware of. They just simply had no answers, unfortunately. As of now, I'm sure you guys all know because you're probably following a lot of this. No changes have been made so far. They're going to be considered this next week. One interesting thing is that Balky did not appear at the press conference, nor, from what I understand, is there anything being put out about him maybe talking tomorrow or anytime soon. There's no information about that. And I don't know where Doug Peterson stands on the hierarchy for the team, but I would guess, based off of today, that he's probably the one in charge, and that there could be a chance that Balky could be considered as one of those people that has to be moved on from. I think it's very unlikely, but I do think it's possible. Just based off the nature of the press conference today, there's no confirmation that he's coming back or anything. I think this is going to be something where they just kind of evaluate it, and then unfortunately probably go the route they have the whole time where they say, oh, we're fine. We're good with what we have. But, we'll hope differently, of course. Now, as far as Lawrence's mood you're talking about, I really don't know. I have no clue. He's a very even keel kind of guy. It's the word I hear for him, and I think it fits pretty well. I mean, there's times where we wish he was a little more vocal, and he just has not been that. And, yesterday was a perfect example of that again, where he just kind of says, well, it sucks what happened, and that's kind of the extent of it. It's like you missed the playoffs. You might show a little bit of emotion. So I don't know. I'm sure he's got some frustration. I wouldn't be shocked by that based off the fact they changed that play call and the fact that Doug Peterson, out of all the people that he didn't really go out to defend, it was Trevor Lawrence. He didn't really say anything good about him in the press conference. And that was weird because you're talking about Luke Fortner in a positive light. You sure as heck probably should talk about Trevor Lawrence that way, even if it was very disappointing. And so I think there's probably a little bit of frustration there. I don't think it's like a breaking point or anything, but that's why I understand. And you're talking about likes from his dad. What exactly was that? Because I saw something today about his dad talking about getting like a new center. He was talking about like Jackson Powers Johnson. That's the only thing I saw, which I didn't really check on, but you'll have to let me know. So we'll have to see what happens this next week. It sucks. We got to wait here for any kind of confirmation on the staff. It's just the nature of it. And if they do make changes, I think unfortunately it could be something they regret because you're going to have a lot of people getting signed this week. You have teams that are proactive like Carolina, like Washington, that knew they were going to make changes. They've already made them. And they're out doing their work right now on who's going to be a part of their teams. And maybe it's, different searches, of course, because you're talking about head coaches as well. But I think that's going to be a detriment if this team does try to make changes. And yeah, maybe he did talk about that. I guess that would make sense, and that would be the observation. I mean, if you're the dad of that player, you see him get hurt 4 times in a season. There's clear issues with the offensive line. I didn't understand why he would say that. I don't think I'd read too much into him talking about a trade. I don't think that's going to happen. I think that's really unlikely. That's more of something that I think would be worst case scenario years down the road. And I don't think that'll happen. But I think they're more so just talking about there has to be more done on the offensive line. And I think when you look at this team as well and how you would rebuild it, I think the interior of the offensive line is probably the one spot where you are just going to redo almost everything. Now, talking about the rest of the division here for a moment before we start looking at like roster moves and where everything is as far as salary cap, I think the future is definitely not that bright for Jacksonville. If I had to put my guess out as of now, which it's very early to guess what the record would be next year, based off of what has been done this year, the fact that there's probably not going to be a lot of changes, that they're still facing an incredibly difficult schedule, especially when you consider how good that division is now, I think this is probably going to end up being an 8 or 9 win team next season. That's the way it looks, because there's not going to be most likely the kind of changes that are going to put you over the edge. There's going to be a Colts team in this division that's going to be severely underrated, that is going to be getting their quarterback back, and they're going to be a team that drafts ahead of you, might go get a really great player that can make an impact. They've got a lot of things going their way. And of course, you have the Houston Texans, who just stole the division from you. You have two very good teams you have to play, and you have a Tennessee team that if they're going to circle games on their calendar, they're going to be against us. They're going to do that every year, and they'll do that for the Texans and the Colts too. But you have a very hard schedule there. You've also got to play teams like the Dolphins, the Bills, the NFC. I cannot remember who they play exactly, but it's the North, actually. All those teams are on the up. I think it's going to be really hard for them to do much better next year without some big changes. And with the amount of issues that they have, I don't know how you fix them all in the offseason without really just being about perfect. So the future is kind of an issue for this team. And also, I'm not sure you can post that account here. I think the way YouTube works in general, it doesn't let you post links unless you're hosting the stream. So, I mean, if you want to shoot it to like my Twitter account, you can totally do that. That'll probably work. But on here, it usually restricts that. So, before we hop into the roster, I'll say this. I would be very concerned as a fan right now with the evaluation of this roster to start. And you can have hope, of course, that this team does well in the future. I will tell you this offseason, I don't expect this team to get much better. I don't expect to be predicting them to be a deep playoff team. I think they could, even with this staff, end up going back. But I don't think this is the kind of team that can handle expectations right now and can go win a Super Bowl, unfortunately. And it's hard because if you had the quarterback who had undoubtedly proven to you that he is the guy, and I think he's come close to that, we'd probably feel a lot different. But with the way this year ended, it's hard to say that. I don't know how you even go into the offseason and say we're going to extend him and this is the future 100% for sure. Like, if I had to predict, of course I'm going to say I think Lawrence is going to be here long term, but I can't go out and pay him right now because I don't know that as a fact. You know, it's kind of the same as like when you're drafting guys. You know, you hope they're going to be the guy. You can have confidence in people, but you don't know 100% for sure. Trayvon Walker be a perfect example of that. But I'm very concerned for what this team has going on right now, and hopefully that'll change in the next week. We'll see, but we have a very complacent owner. And while he is great for spending money and being able to structure cap space, it is not good when you have a problem on your team, because there's never going to be the urgency to make moves when they need to be made. There's going to be the urgency to do that a year after, which isn't urgency at that point, and that's best case scenario. So let's take a look at the salary cap. We looked at this a few weeks ago when we live streamed, so we're kind of reevaluating this. I have all of the players pulled up on here. I also have another tab where I did kind of just some projections on what could happen. I think with how this team performed the last few weeks, you have to consider a lot more players leaving. I think a perfect example of that would be a guy like maybe Ezra Cleveland's. Fadakasi would be one where Fadakasi's like kind of on the edge, but you have to look at like he's on the field with Hamilton, and this team's getting gashed in the run game. And they're getting gashed up the middle by Henry. They couldn't do anything. And so you have to consider there's going to be some changes. Do you pay the guys who weren't working together at a high level a bunch of money? You have to pay every single one of them a lot. Or do you try to build younger? So I think you get a lot more players that probably are going to be gone from this team. You're going to have more cap space to work with. But also at the same time, you're going to have a lot more you're going to have to spend because there's more holes on this team. I think guys like Zay Jones, who we thought may end up performing better at the end of the season and earning themselves another year, probably end up going. Because I don't know how you can look at what they did this year and justify paying them money. And you can absolutely save the amount that they would earn for that year. So like, for example, Zay Jones' contract. It was 24 million over 3 years. You'd think when you look at this, the way this works, that you can only save $4.5 million. The way the restructured contracts worked with Jacksonville last year is that the third year cap hit is essentially split up over multiple seasons. And so you have $4.5 million in 2024, and you have $3.5 million in 2025. So if you cut them this year, you're saving that amount in each season. So it works a little differently. And to offset that, if you're wanting to save the whole $8 million, you go ahead and you restructure another player. You know, a guy like Oluokun might make sense. He'd be a player that I'd go out and extend. And they need to try to find those guys that they can be confident in extending to help ease up the cap situation. So with that, let's take a look over here at some of the stuff we got going on, just to give you an idea of cap space, where they could go. I threw in a couple players they could go after. We will just remove those, though, because we really don't know what direction they'll 100% go. And a lot of normal guys get re-signed. Gregory Jr., Tim Jones, players like that. I think Dearness Johnson earns his way back, and Daniel Thomas, really good special teamer for this team, and then a lot of our bigger players as well. Mr. October says, we talked about the O-line yet. I'm hoping Doug was doing just some lip service and will truthfully do something about this O-line. So, yeah, we're kind of going to get into that. We're going to talk about where it is. Only thing I really hit on so far is I think this offensive line needs a complete rebuild on the interior. As much as I liked Ezra Cleveland coming into Jacksonville, I don't think you can confidently extend him based off the way he played. I think you can absolutely blame it on things if you want. You can go out and say, well, hey, Luke Fortner was so bad that you got Scherf and Cleveland trying to figure out how to do his job for him as well. Of course they're going to play poorly. You can absolutely say that, but you also have to pay him money. You got to pay him a lot of money too, because it's that second contract. And he played pretty well with Minnesota as well. And so I think ultimately, like, he's probably a guy they let go, gets signed to another team on a prove-it deal, and may end up playing really well for that team. But I think he goes. I think Luke Fortner is a player that will be here still, but absolutely needs to be challenged for the starting center job. And what I mean by that is he's going to lose it to someone. And I think at right guard with Brandon Scherf, there was kind of talk where it sounded like he might retire. Potentially, that is complete speculation, but I think that could be a possibility at his age of 33. He's had a lot of injuries throughout his career, and you also consider how much he costs as far as, salary cap and how much you can save. Because he's a guy, if we look at it on here, you save $9 million this year, and then the next season, you're saving 7.5. essentially. So that's a lot of money to save. And do you pay a guy who's okay $16.5 million? I don't think so. I think that's hard to justify. And yeah, man, for Luke Fortner, I mean, that play was as bad as it gets. And I'm sure y'all saw it. Is what Doorman Like is talking about with the quarterback sneak. And of course, the play call got changed. But at the same time, there's no play call where you're ever going to get forklifted 3 yards back when you're the guy snapping the ball. You know when the play's happening and you still can't prepare for it. That's a disaster. And I hope that Doug Pearson watches that and just realizes that maybe this guy isn't the future. Maybe that's not the center quarterback duo that we're going to have, and we need to bring someone else in. I think if you're overhauling the offensive line that hard, and I hope they do, like you probably got to address something in free agency. I think Connor Williams will be a perfect player because while he's going to come off of, I think, a torn ACL, he played incredible for Miami. He's a really good run blocker, which you desperately need on the interior because this team needs to find a way to be two-dimensional. And he's also been a pretty solid pass blocker as well for Miami. I think he's a player you absolutely target, and he was one of the ones I had on here. So, offensive line, those are my thoughts. I think this is a team that has the tackles. I would keep, at this point, probably keep Cam Robinson. That's a different opinion than what I've held for a long time, but I think the way that this season went and what he brings to the team when he plays, which is a mentality of physicality, I think that's huge. I think that's something that's completely lackluster with the rest of the offensive line. I think you got to keep a guy at least for one more season that brings that. And you need a leader on that offensive line too. Because you think if you overhaul the interior and you get rid of Cam Robinson too, the only guy who's sticking around is Anton Harrison. It's a second-year guy. You're just completely redoing everything. So I think it's hard to do that. So that's probably the direction I would go as of now. Of course, opinions are subject to change. That can happen. But this is where I stand, and we don't have any more football games to change our opinions. We know what we got this year. As far as the rest of the offense, I already talked about these guys here. I think they're solid contributors as far as being backups. There's no reason to not extend them for what they're worth. Tim Jones only going to receive the ERFA money. That's $985,000. That's veteran minimum. He makes a 53-man roster. And Dearness Johnson, I think you could pay him probably what you did last year and feel good about it. Now, big debate on the offense is at receiver. I think Calvin Ridley, with the way he played this year, it was questionable at times, but I think we got a really good version of him at the end of the season, and I think he's going to continue to get better from where he is. I think this is a player that if he comes back next year and he stays healthy a whole season, can go put up 1,200, 1,300 yards if this offense runs really well and he's more involved with it. Because unfortunately, we had a lot of games where he just wasn't even getting targeted. So if it was me, considering how he performed at the end of the year, considering as well that your best option in free agency of who's probably going to hit there is Marquise Brown, who I don't think is terrible, but he is not at Ridley's level. Considering that, I think you have to bring back Ridley, or else you're paying maybe a first for like T. Higgins or Mike Evans, and that's probably too much of a price, honestly. And yeah, back to Cam Robinson, like you were saying, Ron, we do need to restructure Cam's contract. And personally, I think it'd be hard to do that with an extension. He would not be a player I would extend this year because he has been hurt a lot. I don't want to make the mistake of going out and paying him for another 2 or 3 years on top of next season, and then he's just not the same guy. And he's just continuing to be hurt. You can't make that decision. And you see how bad that can be, too, when you get a scare like Devon Hamilton's contract. So with Cam, the way I would do it, I'd probably just put void years on his deal right now. I'd probably put 2. Give him a signing bonus of $15 million. That's what we did here. So you get ultimately $10 million you save this year, 2025, 2026, $5 million on the cap. you can survive with that. And you see the cap space just progressively gets better and better for Jacksonville every year. They have a really healthy situation coming up in the next few years that can absolutely change with one off season. But the way it is now, I'm not too concerned about pushing money down the road. I just want to limit it because I don't think that's the best way to run a team when you just send every single thing into one season. I think you got to find the right balance. Unfortunately for Jacksonville, this year they went with the approach of we won't make any moves and we'll hope everything works perfectly. Now, with Ridley, the question is if it's a second round pick. It's nothing is official there. We do not know for a fact whether or not a franchise tag still costs a second or if it goes to a third. That is unknown currently. There was another trade. I wish I knew the name of the player. It was a Giants player, or the Giants were acquiring them, where that player was traded under the same kind of conditions. He was extended for, I believe, 1 year. I don't think it was a franchise tag either. So he got 1 year extension, and it ended up costing them a lesser amount. It did not cost them as if it was a long-term extension. So the way I understand it currently is that Calvin Ridley will probably cost a third-round pick if you are going that route with him with a franchise tag. Now, like you just said, the issue is Josh Allen. Because you can't franchise tag Calvin Ridley and then not get a contract done with Josh Allen. I know the Jaguars will probably take an approach where they try to be smart about how much they pay Josh Allen. To me, it's as simple as this. It's that when you look at Josh Allen, he's your best player on defense. You're not going to win without him. He played like he was the best defensive end in the NFL or outside linebacker. Just pay him what he wants. He's not going to go ask for over $35 million. Like, go pay him $30 million, whatever he asks for. You're not going to cry about a couple $1 million. Like, he has to sign a deal. You cannot let him walk, or you cannot let him get traded. Because that's a move you're going to regret for probably a decade, honestly. And so I just don't think that's an option. I think that it would be easy for me. Like, I'd just sign him to what he wants, be a little lenient with it. Doesn't mean you're going to pay him the absolute maximum he wants necessarily, but you give him a good deal and you take care of it. It's not hard. It's a very easy decision, and he made that an easy decision by the way he performed this year. And yeah, give him the TJ Watt treatment. And I think it was Leonard Williams. I think it was when he got traded to the Giants. I think you're correct on that. So that's what we're referencing. Hopefully that's the case, because that third round pick's not as big of a deal as a second. If it's a second, you got to factor in not only is Calvin Ridley worth paying, but is it worth giving up important draft capital? And yeah, last year I felt like Josh Allen should have been re-signed. Some opinions are good, some opinions are bad. That was a good one, I think, and a lot of other people agreed with me too. It wasn't just mine. But I think regardless, like, you're still paying him a lot of money. You probably just could have got him for, $4 or $5 million less, which that's a big deal. And I think that's a bet that you could absolutely take. He's that kind of player where, he's that good. And I think it made every bit of sense for him to improve this season in a contract year. So I'd definitely be on the same page as you. Only our offensive move I made. So we talked about Zay Jones, Brandon Scherf being cuts on this team. I also have Christian Kirk getting restructured again. I think that's an option the team's going to have to take. To explain why, if I undo this here, see the cap space is just under $30 million. If we go out and we restructure his deal, wrong year here. Let me get back to 2024. Okay. So you save $11 million. Essentially, this much you save on the year restructuring his contract. That's something I think they're going to have to take, because when you look at a lot of these players, when you're restructuring a contract, you're converting your base salary into a signing bonus. And so you have to find the players who have the highest base salaries that you can convert into signing bonus because those are the ones who are going to be the most effective, who are going to save you the most. Because a lot of these players are either on their last year or they've already had it done recently or they're rookies, you get a lot of them like, for example, Trevor Lawrence, he can't do it with rookie contract. Darius Williams, 1 year left right now. I don't know if you extend him this offseason just because he's 31. And then, Roy Robertson Harris, it's $1.7 million. You can't really do a whole ton there. It's going to save you maybe $500,000. And it doesn't really make enough of an impact to be a logical choice for the team. So I think Christian Kirk is a player they're going to have to do it with again. Don't be shocked by that at all. That's probably something that's going to happen this offseason. And I agree also, Ron, the defensive line on the interior is another thing to discuss. I do not think it is as important as the interior of the offensive line, but that's not to say at all that it is not important at all. Both of those are going to be things that have to be addressed. But ultimately, you need to protect your franchise quarterback. That'd be where the focus would go. But it's not necessarily changing what you do in, say the draft. If you got a great player sitting there, Jerzon Newton would be a perfect example of that in the first round. That's a player you could probably go out and bring in. Defensive line reinforcements are going to be needed. This team would benefit drastically from having a really good defensive tackle. And so, I think that's something that would be great for them to focus on. And maybe you get DJ Reader in free agency. That's another player who's going to hit the market potentially. Although, question with him is really injuries. It's not the performance so much. And a lot of this does come down to the bad drafting that they've had. If they had done a better job these past few years, things would be a lot different. And that's another reason why I'm really concerned about this offseason right now, because I look back at 2020, right, when we had our last draft with Dave Caldwell. You look at the picks he made. We all knew as fans that Dave Caldwell wasn't the answer, right? And you see what he did with that, and you compare it to what someone who would have been the next GM, would have been a good hire, would have done. We're not saying necessarily that GM would have been perfect, but you're doing a heck of a lot better than drafting C.J. Stroud, Caleb Von Chason, and Laviska Shenault with your first picks. I mean, we could be talking about a guy like Tristan Wirfs being on this team, or a Justin Jefferson at the second selection we had. That's my concern when we keep a guy like Balky, who he's done some good things, but he's also done some really terrible things. You can pretty easily say he killed the season by not attempting to improve the roster at any point. Do you let that guy pick again for you? Do you throw away another offseason? That is probably the biggest concern to me about keeping Balky, is that I don't fully trust him to get it right. And I guess in the first round he's done well, but after that, it's pretty bad. It is pretty freaking bad for him. And Mr. October, I don't think he'll sit still this year. I think he would make some moves if he's retained, and he probably will be retained. My question is that if he makes moves and this team gets considerably better, they make a playoff run again, say they make it to like the AFC Championship, best case scenario probably for the team next year, does he get complacent again? Is this a guy who's going to like proactively be looking for moves to make? Is he going to be able to pull the trigger? That's another issue because, the trades he makes are really good, and he does a lot of lopsided deals where he's just clearly going to be the winner. It's not enough trades. You get things like Danielle Hunter where you could have got him for a really cheap price compared to what he was worth this offseason. And what did Jacksonville do? They didn't make the move. And you think this team would have been better with him? Absolutely. We might still be alive this season. But they don't make those moves because Balky is essentially always looking for the best deal. He's basically trying to buy like a graphics card online for $100 that's worth $1,000. It's obnoxious. And yeah, Ron, we talked about that, I think, right before you got in here, assuming you haven't seen the whole thing. I think this team probably wins 8 or 9 games next year. And maybe if they just like nail the offseason, that's great. Like they might do a little better. But this division, like we're probably talking 4-2 at best, unless we just really hit the divisional games. We've got the Eagles as our random NFC team who obviously had the same kind of collapse. They just had a better record earlier in the year. But that's a team I actually trust to figure it out. This is not an easy season. The NFC North is on our schedule. Every team in that division has hope for the future. I mean, even the Bears. It's like you're either going to have Justin Fields with superstar talent around him, or you're going to have Caleb Williams with DJ Moore still and all these good players. The Vikings probably going to get back Cousins. And then the AFC, you're playing your division and you're playing the East, who has Aaron Rodgers, probably healthy. You have Josh Allen on the Bills, and you have Tua in a contract year with the Dolphins, most likely. So, yeah, it's pretty scary to look at that schedule next year, because I think you could almost make an argument that somehow, despite finishing second place, we might have a harder schedule than the Texans do. But you never know. Injuries happen. So we'll have to see what happens with that. But this is kind of my outlook on it. Josh Allen, I put it up at $30 million a year. I think that's probably where it lands, and I don't think there's a problem paying him that, because you know who he is, and that's not a guy that I'm ever gonna question the work ethic of, because you do have that question sometimes when you hand out big deals. Like, is this guy just gonna cash the check and be happy about it, and then do the bare minimum? Josh Allen's not that kind of guy. Josh Allen wants to be a leader on this team. He wants to be the driving force for the defense, and you saw that pretty clearly in his interviews this year and the way he performed on the field. I feel very comfortable paying him whatever is fair, and even a little more than that if that's necessary. I don't know if he pushes it like that, but he's a player you just got to bring back. And then my one extension for the offseason I think should absolutely be a lock-it-in thing is with Foyesade Oluokun. The way that's going to look is really bizarre just because of the nature of his contract currently. I had to screw around with the numbers a ton. And you can kind of see why here if we go to it, because you have void years thrown on. You have a massive base salary this year. You also want to have a low cap hit the next season. There's this prorated bonus that's on this current season. So it's a mess. As far as the numbers I got to, I think he's a player you pay maybe 17, 18 million a year. You also look at, for example, actually we'll look on here, the contracts that are currently handed out to linebackers right now. He's already top 5 at 15 million a year. And you look at these other guys, it's 17, 18, 19, 20. So I think it's very reasonable for him to fall in that range with the way he's played for Jacksonville. So for numbers, I think he could get down in 2024 to 15 million. It is currently at 21, so it's not a ton, but 2025 is not going to be a lot either. It's 11 million. And then you got big cap hits 2026, 2027. Consider this, though. Some of this money includes money that's already been pushed down the road from this past season. So you're not paying him $27 million a year. It's just the way that the numbers fall. But he'd be the one player I'd absolutely lock in for a contract extension. Talking about other ones, obviously you got the pending free agents. I'm more so talking about people who have another year left already. I think he's the early guy you extend. And then maybe Tyson Campbell, but he got hurt. Andre Cisco, same thing there. Travis Etienne, that's probably the other one that I could see happening. I could definitely see that. So we've got a little bit still. I want to get off here by 6 my time, 7 your time, I assume, if you guys are all on the East Coast. Because we obviously have the college football game tonight. But I do want to give you guys an early look at the draft board for this year, some thoughts on some players. This is not a complete product necessarily. This is just me starting on it, I have currently like 180 players I've looked at that I have notes on, and there's 40 of them that I've gone into really deep dives on where I feel comfortable talking about them. You got to consider with how many players there are, there's probably going to be some players that aren't going to have perfect notes, but I'll do my best with it. And I'll also post the link to this for you guys. There's no cost to this or anything. I'm just a random guy doing scouting, so it's not like I've got something insane to offer. These are just my opinions. So I'll put that in here. I wish I could pin it. It's not giving me the option, unfortunately. But you guys can go out and view that anytime you'd like. But we'll take a look from the top. Jacksonville. So you can see on Tankathon, they are locked in at the 17th overall selection. It was likely to be 18th if they missed. However, Cincinnati beat the living crap out of the Browns' backups. So they go the same record. And they beat us earlier in the year, so they end up going below us. You also consider the strength of schedule was much harder for them. If you have an easier strength of schedule, you pick earlier because you lost the worst teams, is the way it works. And that's essentially how this all works out for Jacksonville, who had a very difficult schedule this year. But looking at draft prospects, there's a lot of names on here at the top that we're going to be not really thinking of as options because these are players who should absolutely be gone by this point in the draft. 17th pick, that is. And you're welcome, Ron. If you have any questions or like any thoughts on these guys, let me know. Another thing I want to throw out, I will be attending the Senior Bowl in, I think it's 3 weeks now, roughly. That'll be taking place 3 weeks from tomorrow. I'm really excited to do it. I'm going to come down by Jacksonville for a little bit and then swing out by Mobile. So I'll be scouting some of the players out there. I'm trying to see if there's a way that I can talk to some of the players, get like a media pass. I highly doubt it, but nonetheless, I asked. It doesn't hurt to ask. If I can, I'll try to get some thoughts from them. But if you guys have any players you want me to watch, let me know. I'd be more than happy to do it. I've still got to make my list of prospects that I want to go through specifically. I plan to look at receivers really hard. I want to look at interior offensive linemen. I think cornerbacks is another one I'll consider. And then defensive linemen, including interior and guys who play on the edge. Those will probably be the focuses for that. But we'll go ahead. We'll start kind of looking through this board at some of the options. And I have not got the media pass yet. I just asked. I haven't got a response yet. It's pretty unlikely, though, because I'm not really like a media member. I more so just have a YouTube channel and a Twitter account, basically, is the way they'll see it. On here, I've got consensus rankings. These will get updated over time. These are based off of basically the average of where these players are mocked across all different platforms online. So they're supposed to be generally where the players are falling. It shows here if I have them higher, if I have them lower. And so as you get farther down the board, you'll have more variety like Brian Thomas Jr., Michael Penix, guys like that. But this draft class, I'm sure you guys know some about it, but you got an incredible receiver at the top, Marvin Harrison Jr., and you got a lot of other good receivers behind him. You've got guys like Malik Neighbors, play anywhere on a team. He plays in the slot half the time, plays outside half the time. He does it all. But for me, he's a player who feels very similar to what Justin Jefferson did. I have the same kind of conviction about him that I did when Jefferson came out, given that I didn't do a ton of scouting back then. I more so just, as someone who was younger, watched highlight reels and said, this looks cool. I want this guy, which is what a lot of us do anyway. But Neighbors is a fantastic athlete, very productive receiver as well. Probably had the best year in college football this season as far as receivers go when you just consider the production. And that was a heated debate at the end of the year because of the Bolitnikoff Award, which ended up going to Marvin Harrison Jr., who had less production. However, the counter argument is you look at his quarterback, you look at what he has around him. Neighbors is playing with Jaden Daniels. You see here, same school. Daniels ended up being the Heisman Trophy winner this year, had an incredible season. Looks like the next coming of Justin Fields right now with the way he plays. So Neighbors definitely had a better situation. But these are two great receivers. And one you'll see tonight if you watch the game, Romo Dunze, fantastic player as well. I have him kind of in his own tier. The way I see it right now, I think you have 3 tiers for the top guys, all separate, but all really incredible players that most years would end up being first in their class. However, this season is just going to be one of the best that we're going to have for drafting a receiver if we look at that position. Odunze has fantastic size, very big receiver. As far as his catching ability, this is kind of where we get the comp for a guy like Cortland Sutton, where he also has the same size ultimately, but this guy just makes every single catch thrown his way. He is incredible as far as what he can do. And he has also this year been able to just consistently produce. His worst performances of the year were 64 yards and 82 yards. This is a player who's going to come into the NFL with a ton of experience and have the opportunity to maybe be a wide receiver 1 for a team right off the bat. And you could end up seeing him falling past 10. And maybe getting into range where Jacksonville can move up without moving, say, their first round pick next season or something big. And that's the kind of player that you'd be willing to do that for. So those are some of the top receivers. The guy I think right now would probably be my favorite fit for Jacksonville, assuming no one falls, is Brian Thomas Jr. Thomas Jr. played alongside Neighbors at LSU. He's a player who's kind of come on the scene this year. He wasn't even really talked about as a first-round prospect. And I'll tell you, if he went back to college next season, he would undoubtedly be the wide receiver 1 in that next class. He is an incredible player, has fantastic size. He just flashes the ability to do everything really well. But what he is right now is what Jacksonville desperately needs in the receiving core, which is someone who can stretch the field consistently and someone who's going to just be able to make the big play. And thankfully, we got to see Ridley flash that late in the year, but I don't really look at Ridley as that guy primarily. I look at him more as someone who's going to get open all over the field and just be a crazy good route runner. Brian Thomas, just one of the better underdeveloped players of this draft. Not to say he's not developed at all. He's learned a lot this year. He's become a much better player. One of the things you'll see with him, super smooth player. I mean, he just destroys people when they're trying to tackle him. It's hard to figure out where he's going most of the time. This is a guy that we could be looking at, a year or two past the draft and say, this could have been a top 10 pick. It could have been a top 5 pick, perhaps. It's one of those players. And I don't think he's the kind of guy who's not going to work out in the NFL because, well, I get kind of scared because of like Quentin Johnston last year and what happened with him this season. Thomas is a more developed player. He's had a lot of production and just feels like someone who is just more complete and doesn't have any like major concerns coming into the NFL. So that's kind of your look at receivers. There's some other guys we could talk about too, of course. Troy Franklin is a favorite of mine. Emeka Egbuka would be another player, although Egbuka, the question is he going to play outside the slot? And that's something that Jacksonville is going to need. They don't need an air slot receiver because if they did, you just ask Parker Washington to do it at this point and probably feel all right about it. As far as other positions, Brock Bowers is another great player. You're not going to be drafting him, obviously, because we don't need tight ends. And then you got a lot of really good quarterbacks at the top. And that's one thing we all need to be rooting for is a lot of these quarterbacks in the draft who are kind of in the middle, who could be like that Will Levis kind of pick where they fall out, go the second. We need to be rooting for these guys to have really successful combine performances, have good pro days, and for them to ultimately be really early picks because there's so many good players that could fall down the board in this draft. An example of one of those players, if you're looking for a pass rusher, would be Laiatu Latu. The big concern with Latu that you're going to hear over and over and over is going to be that injury history, where at one point he was told he could not continue playing football. There's questions about whether that was too extreme of a medical report or if it was potentially just not that accurate to what his issues were, because he's been healthy for 2 seasons. He hasn't really had those kinds of concerns recently. But it's very similar to another player that came out, I think, from the same college in UCLA, which was Jalen Phillips. He's one of the best pass rushers on Miami's team. And he just had a huge injury this season as well. I can't remember specifically what it was. Might have been Achilles. So that's your concern with him. And he is a bit of an older player, but this is a guy who just, he produces. He is a complete pass rusher in every aspect. I think, like, we talk about some of these other pass rushers who have come out. I think he's better than a lot of them. I think you could argue he's better than Hutchinson was. I think it's really close. And I think you look at Will Anderson. I'm putting these guys in the same camp, but you get a guy who might be able to fall down the board potentially because of some injury history that I'm not really convinced is going to be just a career ender in the NFL. I think he's someone who's still going to stay healthy, and it's going to be something people forget about pretty quick. You've also got some really great tackle prospects, and you've got a lot of tackle prospects that you could look at moving to the inside. Your top guys, Joe Alt, Olufashanu, those people are going to be well off the board by the time Jacksonville picks. So you can pretty much lock those in. They should be gone by 10. If they aren't, some teams moving up for them. You have also got players like Talise Fuaga. I have him marked as a guard. He can play tackle, but there are a lot of players in this draft who could end up moving from tackle to guard and just be really incredible fits for a team. And what you're going to love about a lot of these prospects, just to list a few, we have Fuaga, Barden, and then we also have Troy Fatanu. These guys are incredible run blockers, something that Jacksonville desperately needs. And so I think there's a really high chance that you have one of them available. I think the only one that could potentially be gone is Talise Fuaga, who is the best of the bunch. But ultimately, there's a lot of really good picks to be made there. That could be a direction you go if you like interior offensive linemen or just a tackle. And maybe we do end up getting a tackle and saying that's the direction we go. But that's going to kind of require a different direction from this team because we do have a lot of tackles on this roster currently. If you're looking for a guy to play on the interior of the defensive line, Jerzon Newton, probably going to be your top pick. If you watch Sharif Floyd at all, very similar prospect coming out. He's got a little bit of a leaner build, but it doesn't really change the way he plays. He's a guy who just bulldozes through the defensive line. I have it noted, it's like watching a bull in a china shop. He's always working his way towards the ball, has versatility. This guy plays everywhere on the defensive line. He does everything he can to impact a play. He gets his hands up to bat passes. And he's just someone who's going to be built different for the interior of a defensive line, a player who you're probably going to have to game plan for on a weekly basis if you have to play him. And the issues just aren't really a huge concern. I think this is a slam dunk pick. I think you can put him in the camp of some of these recent interior defensive linemen. Quinnen Williams, you could talk about Jalen Carter from last year. Maybe not at that level, but really close to it. So you got a lot of really good players. This is a very good draft class for guys. And over the offseason, we're going to find the ones that we like the most. I'll just throw out one more before we end this. If you're looking at cornerback, Terrion Arnold. Player that I was not that high on. When I went back to watch it, he performed incredibly for Alabama. And I think he's easily the best cornerback in this draft class right now. There are a lot of players who overperformed in this draft class. A lot of people who should go higher than where they're going to be selected. It is a great year to have a pick anywhere near the top of the draft. And there should be no doubt that Jacksonville is going to have a really good option on the board at 17. It is simply a question of what player is going to be there. So there's a lot to look forward to for that, and we'll try to do more in-depth scouting on these guys, maybe talk about them on the channel, and present them a little better. That's just kind of your introduction to this. It's a very receiver-heavy draft. You have a lot of good offensive linemen, a lot of players who are probably going to be slept on a bit, especially on the offensive line. And then on the defensive line, it's a deeper class as well than what has been in previous years, especially on the interior. Where Jacksonville's needs line up, this is a really good class for it. And I could see them having a really good draft if they can just navigate it properly, because they're going to have the opportunities to hit their picks. So if you guys want to check this out at all, you're more than welcome to. It's available. You can send me any questions about players. I'll tell you the best I can. It's all opinion at the end of the day. And we'll end up being right about some things. We'll end up being wrong about some things. But I think that's all I'm going to have for this live stream. I'm going to get ready to watch this game. Hope you all do too. It's going to be a good one. I'm hoping it ends well. We'll see. But I appreciate doing this. I'm sorry, guys, the season went the way it did. It sucks. I can't say much else than that. And it shouldn't have ended the way it did, but this is what happens when your team is complacent, when they don't make moves, and all we can hope for is that the people in the building can learn from this, and it changes the way they approach it, and that it doesn't happen again, or they get new people in the building that end up not making those same mistakes and being better options. We just got to see what route they go. So that's all I've got. But I appreciate y'all being here with me. That's pretty much it. But we'll have more content out. We'll be talking on the draft and probably free agency to start more. But that's all I've got. So you guys have a great rest of your night. Appreciate it. And finally,